Tell me about the moment you first begin getting alerts that there's maybe an active shooter happening, and then you get a text that says, front office is getting shot, don't call me, we're hiding.
The likelihood of a mass shooting in a workplace or a school has got more and more and more in the last 30 years.
Nobody knows why firemen are firemen. Not even they could tell you why. But it is time somebody try. Firefighting is the most risky of all dead-end jobs, yet also the one where most workers are most likely to punch in early. It's hard enough to believe that. It's impossible to explain it. Any day at the firehouse, the bell from hell puts the dispatcher on the horn with a tenement tinderbox address, into bunker pants, rubber turnout coat, grab the mask and go.
If you're going through these struggles on your own and you're isolated from your tribe, your loved ones, it was crushing. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I never got to the darkest of places, but it was horrible.
Minutes later, you're on site. As others run out, you go in. You'll need all you can carry. The 4-pound axe, a 6-foot hook, the Halligan pry bar. The ceiling concealing the smoldering has to come down, and it's one of those stubborn tin ones. In the scary dark, with heat eating your ears, you are gouging out and tearing loose and pulling apart, gulping air and tasting black. Your windpipe is closing, and you've lost track of which way is out. Is it really worth it?
I think the post-traumatic growth conversation really needs to happen. And so firstly, being driven to find those tools, I truly believe that addressed trauma becomes resilience, becomes a superpower. It's exciting. There's an element of hope when you work through that stuff.
They've budgeted cut your ladder company from 6 men to 5, so now everything you do is 16.67% more difficult and more dangerous. Your air is low. Inside your mask, you're throwing up. There's a searing ember down your neck. Torn gloves exposed, a smashed hand, so you emerge from the Holocaust hugging with your elbows somebody's singed kitten.
If you say that the person who is going to have to climb, slide down a pole from a deep sleep, jump into a fire engine, go light some sirens to your house, climb into the second-story bedroom window, search for your child in the fire, take them out, then do a pediatric cardiac algorithms, they try and save their life on the front lawn, you're fine with them working 56, 80 hours a week. It's insanity.
Then there's that night we lost 2. Oh yes, firemen cry, but only briefly, because now comes the inevitable and ever more paperwork just in case OSHA complains or somebody sues. Is it worth it?
So the irony is it's an easy fix, but it takes a courageous leader. The money is there, but it's down by the drain where it's all washed. You've got to front load that and put it back. And people in the fire service say, oh, you got to see the fire service like a business. And I always tell them, yeah, you do. So stop modeling an Indonesian sweatshop and start modeling Google or Virgin or a progressive corporation. And look what they do. You know what they do? They invest in their people.
Behind graffiti-fouled walls, you saved what you could, but the raging blaze that wanted to consume adjacent buildings did not, because you were there. Back at the firehouse before cleanup, you and the guys sit a spell, tired but stimulated, drinking coffee, laughing, feeling good about one another. Nobody outside your world can ever know this feeling.
One of the pushbacks I get is, well, we can't hire firefighters now. How are we supposed to get an extra shift? You can't hire firefighters now because the working conditions are awful. We're not okay. We just lost an Ohio firefighter to suicide. We've had a suicide and overdose within, I think it was 6 weeks of each other, where I used to work. And then where I live, just over a year ago, we had 2 firefighters, each of which were either side of 30 years old, kill themselves within 12 weeks of each other. So you're telling me there isn't a problem? So this is the thing. You want to bury your head in the sand or up your own ass and ignore this or come out with that ridiculous, it was fine for me. You're ignoring all science when it comes to performance. You're pushing against progress. And then that whole rub some dirt in it, be a real man. To me, those are the words of the coward, to be completely blunt. Because if you're not advocating for what you call your brothers and sisters, then you're a coward. It's that simple.
You're out of the shower now. Most of the grime and some of the cynicism are down the drain when you hear a strangely familiar voice saying, "It is worth it. It is worth it." And you're hearing this voice, and there's nobody there but you. It's a quiet voice from nowhere saying, "For salvaging things and people from flames, I have to rely on your hands." Paul Harvey. Good day.
The Patina'd Podcast is about the earned wisdom found in pain. It's about chasing failure, catching it, and using that as an opportunity. It's about scar tissue and sinew. It's about stretch marks and dented fenders and refusing to hide them. It's about pushing our insecurities and shame to the forefront instead of behind us. Instead of seeing rust as something that compromises a structure's integrity, we choose to see it as the grit that builds character. This is the Patina'd Podcast. All right, well, welcome to the Patina'd Podcast. Today I have James Gehring, and James is a retired firefighter and paramedic. He's a lifetime martial artist and the host of the Behind the Shield podcast, which now has 929 episodes deep. You probably have some in the can right now as we speak, but I'm looking forward to that guest 1000 because I know you do something big every sort of mile marker, so to speak. Do you already have an idea of who that's going to be, James?
I do, and there's a reason why. The timing is pretty good for that too. So yeah, watch this space.
Wow. Okay. So we'll just leave that as a cliffhanger. All right. So again, the Behind the Shield podcast. So yeah, podcasting is not something new to you. And yeah, 929 episodes is an incredible commitment, which probably speaks to resiliency, and resiliency is the undertone and the theme of my podcast. So we'll definitely get into that. But to go that many episodes into podcast speaks to the resiliency of a person, no matter who you are. So that's incredible. And also the author of a great book. I know you got one in the works right now, but man, your book, One More Light. So I've gone through it 1.5 times now. My first time going through it, I'm a trauma therapist, James. And my first time going through it, there were some parts in the first 3 chapters where I had to pause and just be like, okay, I'll come back to this. I'll come back to it. Because it was there. Maybe it was because my sessions were heavy that day that I had with clients or whatever. Or maybe it was something too close to home with kids related. But it was something where I'm like, I can't absorb this right now. I don't have the space for it right now. I'm going to come back to it. And I'm a trauma therapist. So the book is so good. It's so well written. First of all, like the opening with Josh Brolin, like he kind of sets it up beautifully because it is really well written. It hits you in the heart. It's a punch in the face in certain points. And so I think without giving away too much of your book, I want to kind of go into it somewhat because I want people who are watching this to go and check out your book. For me, I have dyslexia is one of my learning disorders. And so reading is a challenge, not as much as it used to be. Here in my adult years, I've been able to read a little bit better, but still my reading comprehension is a challenge. So for you to be able to narrate your own book on the Audible form was so helpful for me. So for people out there who are just like, oh, I don't do books, no matter how good they are, I don't do books, the Audible form, and to have you reading it and emotionally connected to your own words, that was great. I mean, I can keep going on and on with the intro here, James, but yeah, man, I'm happy to have you on.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mean, firstly, it's great to be on. I really appreciate it. And obviously with your background, not only of when you were wearing uniform, but your very courageous vulnerability of your journey since, is important. And I think there's so much need for culturally competent clinicians, whether they've come from a responder or military background into psychology or psychiatry, or they've just dived in from the other way. They came through psychology and then really immersed themselves into our cultures. But it's imperative. But it's funny you say about the audiobook, because Josh Brolin arguably is one of the best voices in Hollywood. And I always say, then I had to follow that with my squeaky ass English voice. So
Yeah. He has an amazing voice. Like he's the epitome of man's man. He's got the whole masculine vibe. He's like maybe he's the Clint Eastwood of our time, maybe in terms of man's man or masculinity. So yeah, James, you just mentioned, and I appreciate that compliment. I am a therapist, and with the background of my own traumas, childhood traumas and things like that, addiction and PTSD from combat and all that kind of stuff, which kind of led me to where I am therapeutically and where I am now as a therapist. It's like I remember as kind of a joke, like when I was first starting to get help with my own mental health issues. It was like a joke how many people would want to know about my childhood. It's like, bro, like that has nothing to do with anything. Like my childhood was fine. Sure, my parents were divorced, and sure this might have happened, and sure, but I was fine. Like no big deal, I'm like nothing massive happened to me. And I found out I was wrong later on as I kept digging in. I'm recognizing how it was connected to childhood. So now what I like to do with guests is I like to go into some of that origin story because it's interesting. So yeah, let's kind of get into your origin story, James.
So yeah, I mean the value of that is so important. Before we get to mine, I think I was blown away by how many people that had seen and done horrible things in uniform that wasn't the real root of their trauma, and it was actually something that happened before we ever put the uniform on. And obviously the result is a combination of both. But so when I look back at mine, I mean I had such a great childhood from one perspective. I really did. I mean, I grew up on a farm in England. My dad was a veterinary surgeon. So we had a horse farm, horse stables on the farm, and I would literally help him do surgeries on animals, all creatures great and small, as they say. I had 4 brothers and sisters. I was the oldest boy, and I had an older sister. So there was so many things that were right about the upbringing, but it was interesting because, for example, some of the traumatic experiences. So the house fire I wrote about, and I think it was one of the first chapters. We literally almost died in a house fire. My 8-year-old sister got us out. That's obviously a pretty acute trauma. And it's funny because when I wrote my first book, I'd forgotten about that. Not buried it away. I'd just forgotten about it, which you'd think it would be at the forefront if you end up becoming a firefighter, but I'd never put those two together. But there was another near-death experience where there's an attraction in England called Wookey Hole, and we were Cheddar Gorge, and we were just at a pub. I think we got some food and we were using the toilet, and there was a wall, like a massive retaining wall. And just when we went to drive away, there was a guy digging in his garden, and the entire wall, just a massive crack, and the whole wall came tumbling down. Every car that was parked right where we were was crushed down to the wheels. So pretty significant, and we were like picked up by the wave of bricks. So another, near-death experience. My parents, when I was kind of mid-teens, had, I discovered it had a pretty awful marriage, and they had a very, very traumatic divorce. And so there were all those things. But what's interesting about my early life, and I think this is an important conversation in the resilience world, is I had arguably an equal and opposite amount of healing mechanisms built into my childhood, but through no choice of my own. So when people like, how come this guy, can't deal with combat, can't deal with a firefighter? What's wrong with? I'm fine. Well, I'm no better than anyone else. And the reason why I think I didn't struggle as much in my career is if I look back, I had community. We had people from, travelers like the homeless and gypsies all the way through to extended royal family come through our doors to the farm, because gypsies have horses, polo players have horses, you know what I mean? So it was a very diverse group of people. My dad was a healer, so I got to see him care about animals. My parents were very kind. I mean, they definitely were that. But I had nature, I had fresh air, I had community. We ate around a kitchen table, most of our meals together, laughing, joking. So all the things that you identify as very healing were also present in the time where I almost died a few times when I was young. So when I look back, yes, there were some elements of trauma, but there were also elements that allowed me to process that trauma early on, which I feel then kind of created a sort of resilience. Because I think that unaddressed trauma can be a fracture in your foundation, But I truly believe that address trauma, process trauma becomes a superpower.
Yes. Yeah. That's huge. That's very true. And I have a question for you later on about that, even within the processing of trauma. So anyway, I'm going to hold on to that because I want to talk about that later. But okay, so your childhood, being on a farm, there's hard work, right? Like, so you're doing things, you're helping your father with his medical practice on animals, right? Which is very interesting. I'm not sure you could get away with that these days, at least ethically. I'm not sure you could get away with that, but you're helping your dad out with that. And then but you're also, so are you working on the farm? Are you tending to animals or the land? Like, what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was funny actually because I would go to school tired in junior school, and I remember getting chastised, and they were like, "Oh, you're probably watching television all night." Well, I wasn't. We were lambing, or some dog got hit, and some broken-hearted person knocked on the door at midnight. And again, and when I say I helped my dad, I wasn't in the guts with the scalpels. I was assisting him and handing him tools and that kind of thing. But so yeah, but I mean, there was absolutely an element of work. I was in charge of all the fowl, so the chickens and geese and ducks and all that. But we had sheep. We didn't really have cows, but you had horses that need to be ridden and exercise, which is I was never a good rider, but I was brave. Let's just put it that way. But yeah, so there was absolutely a work element, which again, when you factor into the fire service and that kind of physical and mental resilience. It's cold in England, it's wet, mucking out stables and, getting kicked by horses. I mean, there was an element of suffering in a good way, in a positive way, in an old school way. But yeah, I mean, hard work was definitely part of it. And then even we were kind of feral children. So a lot of times we had to cook for ourselves. We had to clean. We had to, do all the things that maybe some people, let me rephrase that. My son now, I have to kind of work against doing a lot of things for him and kind of introduce that, because it's hard to reproduce the suffering you had on an English farm in an American suburban neighborhood.
The ability to reproduce that, I'm not sure even how to do that in full entirety. Yeah.
Well, I think a healthy sport has definitely helped. So he got into cross country, he did jiu-jitsu, he did track the last couple of years. Now he's into volleyball and skimboarding, which involves a lot of falling over and having to get back up again. So I think that is a great outlet, as long as they don't get dragged down I need to win a scholarship or I need to make a living out of doing this. And then I think you kind of deviate from the core lessons of sport.
Yeah. Teamwork, leadership, hard work, sacrifice, getting back up even though you failed, all that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's great. And so, talking about athletics, how about for you growing up and athletics that you were involved in and that sort of stuff?
So I was always the kind of kid that would play everything. Like, there was literally on our, between our classes in my senior school, one of my friends got into American football, which was unheard of back then. So we used to play that touch football. We used to play a kind of version of what we call rounders, just like one-handed baseball. And we remember we had a chair leg. The whole time we played for 2 or 3 years, it was a chair leg and a tennis ball. So yeah, I was always about playing. I didn't worry about, winning stuff. But then when I was in my, when was it? Probably early teens, I got dragged into the world of martial arts, and I was obsessed. Jackie Chan and Bruce Lee. I had the posters. I had the Wing Chun dummy in one of the pig sheds in the farm. And so then I did get into competing. So I started off, did Taekwondo for a bit, then went to karate, then went back to the ITF Taekwondo, which is kind of like the semi-contact stuff. Got it, did very well in that, won some national titles and stuff. But that was really my love. And then aside from that, water sports, so windsurfing and water skiing, and then the snow sports too, skiing. And so yeah, I mean, if it's something fun, I want to play. I don't want to watch it, and I don't want to watch other people do it. I want to do it myself. But that was the thing. So there was no one real passion. Like, I play football even, but I wasn't great compared to a lot of my English friends. But I'd play it. So yeah, it was very different than that kind of more laser focus that I've seen with my son, where at one time he's all into that one sport.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you say that in terms of, if I could play it, I'd do it. rather than watch it. As an American, I think about the English fan, and it's ravenous and it's aggressive. And it's like, I don't know, you take the college football fan that's of the appropriate college football age, say like 22, and then you put that into a 45-year-old man that has been drinking beer for the last 30 years. And then that's what the image of the English soccer fan is, you know? So, but for you, you didn't really get tapped into that, or the English fandom of watching a game, or you just preferred playing?
I think it's really weird because I look back now and wonder why I have the lens that I do that seems to buck against the way a lot of people are conditioned. And when I was young, I remember just thinking, why would you fight over 11 dudes in shorts? I just don't get it. I just don't, you know? And this whole we won last night. You didn't win. You weren't playing. You weren't anywhere near the stadium, you know? So that part, especially when there was a negative side to it. And then even, you know, like the war, I grew up and the Falklands War happened. And again, kind of really reframed military service to me, because I was like, oh, wow. So a politician can just say, yeah, we're going to go do this. And then you guys have to go, whether you like it or not. So even us as a young boy, I'm talking like 8 or 10 years old. So yeah, I don't think it was just the simplicity of farm life, kind of reframing it. But what's interesting with sports that I kind of observed when I came to the States is, even though there is a lot of kind of, you know, passionate fandom in the UK, usually a lot of those guys will still play. So they'll play cricket or football or rugby into their 30s and 40s and 50s. What was really weird for me is when I came to the US, I kept meeting mostly firefighters at this point. And it was, you know, the Uncle Ricos. Like, oh, I would have been in the NFL had it not been for my meniscus, my MCL, my slap tear, you name it. And after a while, I'm like, what the hell are we doing to our kids in high school and college? And then, you know, you live here longer and then you have conversations like this with high-level coaches and athletes, and you realize that in the States, we eke a high performance out of our youth, but sometimes it's at the detriment of their wellness. And we've got that kind of muddied. So that's why I think you don't see a lot of activity in 20, 30, 40-year-olds in the US. It's this high level and then this steep drop, because we're not fostering enjoyment of play, where, you know, if you're not first, you're last, which has its place sometimes. But for the average person, if you still love playing soccer, lacrosse, whatever it is, and you keep playing, that's a massive win, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's a runner named Bronco Billy, and he actually just got second place. He's in his 50s. He got second place at Cocodona 250 last week. He was leading the whole way up until the end, man. And the way he says it is like, you only got so much peanut butter to spread on the slice of bread. Don't just put it all chunk in one place. Like, make it thin, spread it out evenly, so it covers the whole bread. That's what makes me think about what you're saying, is you can go too rabid in the beginning, and perhaps that's parents kind of living vicariously and putting too much pressure at the beginning, and so therefore that the peanut butter doesn't have enough to spread all over the place. It's all jam-packed in one area.
Yeah. I mean, a perfect example, you think about a heavy kid in high school. Is the football coach going to most likely tell them to keep eating because they want you to be a brick wall? Or are they going to be like, look, if you carry on, you're going to have some serious issues. It's going to be hard to start losing this weight. It's probably going to be option A. So that does a massive disservice to that young man or woman. Now they're 25, 30, and now they're morbidly obese and can't reverse a lot of the diseases they've got going on.
Yeah. Unless they take Ozempic, which is an episode that you should get into on James Gehring's when you talk to Johan Ari. But yeah, that's a whole topic. We could talk about that for 2 hours. So I'm not even going to get into it today. Okay, let's see. So you went to college for athletics. I'm messing up the degree that you had.
Exercise physiology.
Exercise physiology. And so you've been, it sounds like for the majority of your life, your headspace has been towards exercise or fitness. And so I'm kind of skipping forward a little bit, and fill in some gaps if there needs to be. But what happened at college that got you eventually to the place you are today? Because I think you did some you did some stuntman work, and you kind of bounced around doing different jobs, and then you found yourself in the academy. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, really, the reason why, well, there's more than one reason, but the thing that dislodged my career goals was in senior school in England. So probably about 12, they do the annual physicals, and they pulled out the color vision book, and they said, nah, you're colorblind. You can never be a pilot. You can never be a firefighter. And all the things that I wanted to be pretty much were taken off. So very long story, very short. The other thing I wanted to do, I wanted to be a firefighter, a stuntman, a pirate, and a doctor. Those were my 4 choices that I wanted to be. I watched The Fall Guy, which ironically, I just interviewed the stunt double of The Fall Guy for Ryan Gosling the other day. But so then when it came to the doctor side, initially I'm thinking doctor, like, GP. So I start the academic route and just fail miserably. Like the math side was just not my wheelhouse at all. And it kind of really left me kind of directionless for a while. And I think a lot of, something we don't think about with a lot of our 18-year-olds here or 16-year-olds in the UK is how many of us really knew in the heart of hearts what we were going to do when we left. I think there's a lot of anxiety about that. Like you just flung out, and all you've known since I went to start school at 3. That's all you've known your entire life is this: show up on Monday, weekend is off. And so you have some idea, and then they tell you, oh, you can't do those things that you were dreaming of doing. I think there's a mental health conversation even there.
Yeah.
But so I kind of fumbled around a bit. I lifeguard. I worked in summer camps in New York. And then while I was traveling around the world with a girlfriend who I'd gone, so she went to drama school. My girlfriend I met in the summer camp, she's English. I ended up auditioning just so I could be closer to her. I got in the drama school, discovered I was the world's worst actor, but I was good at the stunt side, the sword fighting and all that. So then we travel the world. I get hired in the Universal Studios in Japan as a stuntman to open the theme park there. And then I literally was doing stunts until literally about a year ago. So that was a parallel career. But then while I was working in Japan, the previous relationship hadn't worked out, and I met my son's mother. So I ended up getting married to an American, and that's kind of what brought me out here. And so how I got to the academy, and I think this is a kind of an important takeaway, is I had an aha moment at like 26 years old, which is way too late, but I'm not colorblind. I can see colors, but you're so, dragged into, well, the man with a white coat and a stethoscope told me, so it has to be true, and then you question it, and you're like, well, why don't you just name some things in this room and I'll tell you what color they are? And that's what happened in the States when I was trying to go to fire school, and they were like, oh yeah, you're fine, and they checked the box, and that was it. So then you kind of look at the way that color vision is even viewed. It would be the same as saying you're either legally blind, like you have no eyeballs, or you're 20/20 like a hawk. Well, there's obviously stages in the middle where you can still function fine, 20/40, 20/60, whatever it is. And it's the same with color vision. So that was a kind of bizarre twists and turns that took me back to the profession I dreamt of when I was young, and having to just question being told you can't do something and then figure out how you can do something.
All right, real quick. So in the theme of resilience, I have 2 challenges for you, the listener. The first challenge: if you find this interview insightful or interesting, you really like the content that is coming in, please like, follow, share, subscribe, all of those things within whatever platform you use. Tell a neighbor, tell a friend, talk to your cat about it. Let's get this out there. This show is real tiny, and the interviewees that come on the show and share their insight, their wisdom, it can help a lot of people. So the more that it can get out, the better that it can serve the mission that I'm trying to do, which is to normalize chasing failure. So the second challenge that I have for you is to invest 15 minutes of your time into a timeshare opportunity that I have for you. I'm just kidding. I'm not selling you a timeshare opportunity. But what I am doing is I want you to take 15 minutes of your time and invest that into another episode that I have done. Please help me know. What I'm hoping for is for you to come in the comments section and give me some good feedback. Maybe scrutinize me a little bit. Let me know how I can be better as an interviewer to help this show be more palatable for you. But this isn't all about me. How did you like the guest?
What were some of the insights that you got from the guests? Leave that in the comments section as well. This is all good stuff. So within the theme of resilience, those are the 2 challenges that I have for you. Help me, help you, help the show. Let's get better. Let's keep growing. Thanks, guys.
How old were you when you started into the fire service, the fire academy, kind of taking on that dream that you had as a child?
I think I was 26 when I started, and I'm 27 when I graduated and got hired.
So you start in your mid to late 20s in terms of the fire academy. Any important lessons that you feel like you took from just the academy itself? Was it extremely challenging at the time? Because I'm not sure what the regulations are now to pass the fire academy, but like how was that experience for you at the time?
I think the biggest takeaway was taking it seriously, which obviously I hear from a lot of people in the military as well, if they're trying to go through selection, especially if they're kind of trying to go on a higher tier. So even though I was an athlete, I knew nothing about the fire service too. So, there's a lot of people in the States that either volunteered or they had family that were firefighters. I knew nothing about the American fire service. So I was kind of blind in one respect, but what I did control is everything that was in my power. So I worked in a publishing company and went to school at night and at weekends. And so I would work out on my lunch breaks. I would run, I would do all the things to make sure, well, at least physically, they're not going to beat me there. And then when we started getting into the academic side, I'm not very good. I can't make flashcards. I can't read a book and remember. So I have to just buy 5 study guides and then just keep working through practice tests, keep working through a test, get them wrong. Why did I get them wrong? And it's interesting because I was a straight C student in school in England and became an A student in fire, EMT, and then ultimately paramedic school. And so that's another interesting kind of perspective, is when you find something that you really love, that you really want to do, it's not that you're a C grade person. It's more about your passion and your interest in a certain area. So that was kind of the thing. And I ended up doing very well physically. I got some awards and stuff for, top performance as far as that side. And academic, there were people that were doing better than me, but I was up in that top tier. But it was also going back to the early life. There were people that tapped out. There were people that quit. There were people that barely made it. But ever since the beginning, my whole thing, again, understanding like this is so important to be as good as possible at this, because if you don't, you might die, your partner might die, or the people that you're trying to rescue might die. So I think that severity really was implanted very early on. I think I was lucky as well. The journey that I took by chance, the academy and then my first fire department, it really just set that bar extremely high. And once you've been held to that standard, and you reach that bar, it really does kind of sear it into your mind that that's where it should be. Because I'm no exceptional human being at all, but it really does forge great firefighters when you're held to a high standard.
So in this time, you're married, and then you have a child. You have a son, I believe. And yes. At what age did your son come into your life, and how was that impact on you?
Yeah, so the way it happened, I trained in Orlando as a firefighter and an EMT at the time. Then I began kind of like a gypsy fire career, because my ex now, my son's mother, she was a performer. We met in a theme park. So initially we went down to the Miami area. That was my first fire department. Again, amazing bar. What had happened is they hired, it was very hard to get hired back then. It was the antithesis of the recruitment crisis that we see today, where you're testing against thousands of people for a handful of jobs. And so I got hired at this place, but it was non-cert, so civilians. But because so many people that were already certified were looking for jobs, about half of our class already had their fire and EMT or paramedic. So while they sent these civilians off to do the whole fire and EMS school, we were on the fire ground just getting beaten up every single day, and it was phenomenal. They carved us into, arguably fantastic fire recruits who weren't experienced, but we were recruits. And so I was there for almost a year. Then she wanted to go to Hollywood, go to California and pursue the whole acting thing. So I ended up getting hired in Anaheim, which was absolutely hands down my favorite department. So I worked there for a few years. I was a tillerman on a truck. That's when you drive the back of the fire truck. And, a lot of fire, just a lot of calls. And so during that time is when we had my little boy. So after about a year, she wanted to move back to Florida to be closer to the family. And, family is always going to come first, no matter how in love I am with a department or a career. That's always trumped by your family. So we moved back east. I left my dream department, and then, if I'm being completely honest, spent another 10 years trying to find what I had in California, and it was never the same. I had some good people that I worked with, amongst, but not that cohesive department where everyone was really on board and got it. So that was it. And then the parenting side is kind of important with the next transition. So I worked for Orange County, which is the county around Orlando. And during that time, ended up getting divorced. And so now I'm a single dad. And as their recruitment starts getting worse and worse, there's a lot of what they call mandatory overtime. So you do 24-hour shift, and then at 7 a.m, the phone rings and they're like, we need you to stay another 24. And you've got a 3-year-old waiting for you to come home to be parent and take care of them. So this is the unspoken part of the fire service is, you'll see people getting forced. What people aren't acknowledging is the impact that has on a family if mom or dad can't go home for yet another day. So it started off in a nuclear family where it was good and he had her at least. Then that family disintegrates, and now I'm taking care of him and juggling all these other things. Now it shifts again. That's why I ended up in my last place, where they were fully staffed. They had a little bit more time off, arguably the worst fire department I've ever worked for. But that aside, from me being present with my son, that's kind of what made me make that move to the last place I worked at.
I mean, divorce rates within the service community, first responder community, military community are all pretty high. Is that kind of what was taking place within the marriage and the divorce? Was it situational within your fire service that kind of helped spur that?
Of course, there was an element of that, but ultimately with this one, when I was at the fire station, someone else was in my house. So that was the reason for the divorce. So that's kind of cut and dry. But that aside, what I think people assume is that, well, we see horrible stuff and then you change and then you're angry at home, and which is absolutely a little portion of it. But the big thing I see in the fire service, and obviously that's the community that I know, is just our work week alone. The average work week in the States for a firefighter is 56 hours a week. So you're 24 hours straight, and usually you're awake for all of or a lot of that. And then you go home the next day, and then, which you've obviously worked from midnight to 8 a.m. So you go home after that, and then you basically have one day, and then you're back again. And it's 10, 20, 30 years of that. And then, like I said, now you add in where you don't get to go home. Now you've worked 48 hours. You go home at 8 a.m. and then that night you're getting ready to go back to work. So you think about how little you're seeing your children, your wife, your husband. So that's the big thing. There's all the parts, what we see and all that stuff. And, elements of PTSD, of course, they factor in. But to me, the biggest thing is, and I say this to people, if you went into a grocery store and they said, well, the starting week is 56, but you might have to work 80 hours, you're not going to take that job. But if you say that the person who is going to have to slide down a pole from a deep sleep, jump into a fire engine, go lights and sirens to your house, climb into the second story bedroom window, search for your child in a fire, take them out, then do a pediatric cardiac algorithm as they try and save their life on the front lawn, you're fine with them working 56, 80 hours a week. It's insanity. So the fact that we have this disconnect of what we ask our first responders to do and the environment that they work in, you couple into that relationships. And then, as we talked about at the beginning, the impact of that, and then addiction, drinking, and those kind of things, and how that messes your sleep up even more. Those really are the underlying reasons. If a firefighter worked a 42-hour work week and was able to be home 24 hours more between every shift, which is 42 hours, the same as civilians work, I think you would see a massive increase in marriages staying strong. but you're already gone for all that time. And then at any time, an agency can say, you're just staying longer. You're just staying longer. And if there's a hurricane or a wildfire and you have to be all hands, no one's going to complain about that. But they've been doing it for decades, just relying on this minimum staffing. So I don't think it's the job, the profession, the actual calling of being a firefighter. Of course, that has an impact. It's the environment that our responders work in and the lack of support they get that I think really contributes to the relationship problems.
The other part of it is, like you said, somebody else was in your home while you were working. If I'm putting myself in that situation, like the overwhelming sadness or betrayal that I would have, that I'd be feeling in that time, I'd want to work as many hours. I'd be like, give me another overtime. Give me another overtime. I don't want to deal with life right now. So for that period of time for you, what was that situation for you personally?
When something like that happens, you already focused on your child or your children. They are your world usually. And so now the marriage or the partnership, whatever an individual has, dissolves. Now that becomes a singular focus on protecting your kids. I can't save the adult relationship, but I can at least be a buffer to my child and, not overcompensate, but try and minimize the damage. So no, it didn't keep me away. I fought tooth and nail to make sure I was there as much as I could, to the point where I left that department, literally. They told me I was going to be forced yet again. Like 9 o'clock, and by 9:20 I'd already had the email sent to him that this was going to be my last day. That's how serious I was about it. So yeah, but it's interesting because you talk about taking more time. I think that's another under discussed element in the first responder professions. We have to excuse the expression, we have a term, the overtime whore, like the man or woman that just takes all the overtime. And you've got to question that, like, why is it that you don't want to go home? Is it you've convinced yourself, oh, we need more money, but the most important currency in the world is time with your loved ones. You can't get that back. So is there actually an underlying reason why you don't want to go home, or you don't want to stop working? Because if you stop working, is your mind going to start ramping up and you're going to have to think about the things that you don't want to think about? So I think that's a big part of it. But what's another thing, and obviously it's more extreme for me because I'm from another country, but even if it's people that are just from another state, a lot of people are going through this on their own too. So I didn't have in-laws or parents or siblings to help share the load with my son. It was just me. Everyone else I loved were thousands of miles away. So that's another element of that kind of load that you shoulder to protect your child, is that you don't have, as you know from a counselor, you've got to have people that you can offload that kind of vicarious trauma to. Well, if you're going through these struggles on your own as a single mother, a single father, whatever that relationship is, and you're isolated from your tribe, your loved ones, that can be, it was crushing. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I never got to the darkest of places, but it was horrible.
Tell me about the moment you first begin getting alerts that there's maybe an active shooter happening, and then you get a text that says, front office is getting shot. Don't call me. We're hiding.
So I'll go back a couple of weeks to kind of set up what happened prior. So obviously as a firefighter, in the good departments, we did a lot of training for this. In the bad departments, we did almost no training for this. But the likelihood of a mass shooting in a workplace or a school has got more and more and more in the last 30 years. And I was literally dropping my son off to his elementary school at the time after a doctor's appointment. And, you go in, you sign them in, and then you walk out and they go off to school. Well, right when I'm signing it, I hear the door close and then alarms go off. And they said, Mr. Geering, you've got to come. You got to stay here. We got a code red. And I knew what a code red was because at the time, whatever he was, anywhere from 5 to 9-year-old child had to rehearse his potential murder in his school over and over again, just like we had to do fire alarm drills. But the thing is, no one was actually trying to kill us. We just had to leave the building back then. It wasn't scary. So
it was fun. It was like a nice break from class.
Yeah, exactly. Oh God, I hated, algebra. Thank God there's a fire alarm. So, but this is far from that, these poor kids. So we're in this kind of back, the behind the reception is a little office, and there's, papers and the paper guillotine and all the things that you find in an office. And as a first responder, I'm just blown away by the lack of communication through no fault of anyone. You're waiting for this person. You can't really communicate, but you just saw how vulnerable these teachers and the other people and obviously the kids, but especially the teachers, because they're the ones supposed to protect the kids, how powerless they were against this potential threat. And I'm literally looking at the paper guillotine thinking, well, I'm going to have to snap the arm off and use it as a machete. And, you got one chance, you know what I mean? So it ended up being a real threat, but wasn't enacted. It was a disgruntled partner of one of the children's parents, a mother, who threatened to come to the school and do bad things. So they took it seriously, and good for them. Nothing happened, thank God. But my goodness, it gave me an incredible insight from being the other side of the wall that I would be if I was as a firefighter and a paramedic. So then I think it was only a handful of weeks before those texts came in, and I'm outside with my wife, and we were walking before the text came in, and all these sirens started going, and the road that goes alongside my subdivision goes then over a red light, and then the next thing is the high school where my son actually goes now, my youngest. And that's when I started getting the text. It's from my bonus boy, my stepson. And what had happened, they actually had a shooting in one of our other high schools in town. And it was, thank God, one of those rare events where I believe the kid didn't actually want to do it. I truly think it was a cry for help, because he shot once down through a door. There was a kind of ricochet that hit one kid in the ankle, and I'm sure I'm not downplaying the absolute terror for the kids, but as we see, sadly, a lot of these shooters, they have multiple weapons, multiple clips. I mean, they're not going to be deterred. And he fired one and then laid his gun down. An incredibly courageous teacher kind of talked him, away from the weapon, and then an incredibly courageous SRO, unlike Uvalde and Parkland. This gentleman went running towards the gunshots, and they detained him. But my stepson's school, they thought there was an attack there as well. So again, thank goodness there wasn't. But now we actually have a shooting in one of our local schools. So I've interviewed, one of the pupils from Parkland, whose boyfriend was killed in Parkland, and then her father, Tony, was one of the firefighters that responded to the school. So he's responding to potentially his own daughter's murder. So yeah, I mean, that whole conversation is so important. And as say in the book, the problem is with that is the moment it happens, you have the pro and anti-gun camps set up trenches like it's Flanders Field in World War One, completely disregard the emotions of any of the people that were actually affected, and then start lobbing, things at each other. And then we don't fix anything, rather than actually taking a step back and having the nuanced conversation of mental health, video games, of course, firearms, the side effects of psychiatric meds, bullying, the mental health of households. I mean, all these elements of this jigsaw puzzle that ultimately will start to fix this issue. Because up until, I think it was Columbine in the 90s, we weren't having school shootings. This last 30 years has just got worse and worse and worse and worse. So having that insight really kind of made me lean into that conversation. And again, just like your work, mental health is a massive part of it. No mentally sound child is going to pick up a gun and say, I'm going to go shoot my friends and teachers today. But that whole conversation is just downplayed. And you're not taking my guns, or we're taking all the guns. And the middle ground is, let's talk about all the things that created this perfect storm that almost killed my children.
So you've talked with experts. Now you have your own personal experience with this topic. You kind of laid the groundwork with the nuanced things that need to be addressed within it. Is there a way, I don't know if there's a way to even summarize how to instill or how to integrate all those nuanced components that you just addressed? And what does that look like?
I think firstly, I mean, it's a massive mental health conversation. And even as you touched on before we hit record, obesity is a mental health conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it's also an environmental conversation. You know, I've said this many, many times. I don't walk around looking at down my nose going, oh, why do people get fat? I'm not fat. I grew up on a farm with a vegetable garden, you know, and meat that we would slaughter. I was raised around the right way of eating because I just won some lottery and ended up being born where I was born. And it's the same with this. We got to create an environment for health, mental health as well. So reverse engineering all the way back to our schools, because obviously that's a great way of really imparting some powerful elements of health in our children. We've got to understand the impact of childhood trauma. That, you know, again, it's not doom and gloom. I as we touched on earlier, I truly believe that addressed trauma becomes resilience. It becomes a superpower. It's exciting. There's an element of hope when you work through that stuff. But one of the conversations we hear a lot with crime is, oh, well, it's these broken homes. It's like, yes, exactly. But you don't just tell people, hey, you need to get back together. And just like my parents. And I know there's some significant trauma on both of my parents' past that they never really processed. So until we're addressing this generation now and stopping that domino from falling, it's just going to keep falling. Because if mother or father, you know, were addicts, or they're in prison, or they died, or, you know, whatever it is, it's this vicious circle that just keeps rolling and rolling. And you don't fix that with arresting people or shaming people. You fix it with compassion and empathy. So I think that the mental health conversation would be a huge impact. And so, you know, reverse engineering a lot of this trauma to, you know, how can we raise kind, compassionate children that don't bully? I think the other side of that conversation is the physical side. I mean, one of the most disgusting things that came out of COVID is the fact that we had a absolute captive audience when it came to our health. Like, everyone was watching the screens. So what a beautiful way to educate people on exercise, on nutrition, on how to cook, on all these, you know, these elements. And then also, while everything's shut down, get the soda machines out the schools, get real food being cooked in the kitchens again like they used to, put PE programs back, fund sports so that, you know, certain kids can't afford to play football because you need $400 for uniforms and all this stuff. Like, remove the barriers to entry, bolster local farms, give them incentives to grow organic food locally. So you're not shipping it from another country and covering it in chemicals and radiation. So there are a lot of elements, but so many of them are fixable, because if we didn't have this problem 100 years ago, then if you mimic what we did 100 years ago, there's probably 80% of your answer there. And so if our children weren't murdering each other in schools, and we weren't 70% obese or overweight 100 years ago, then the way we moved, the way we ate, the community that we had, the amount of time we were in nature are probably massive parts of the solution. So it is multifaceted, but I think that's the first go-to, because the more you improve mental health, the more all the other factors improve as well.
Yes. And as you pointed out, mental health has to be connected to physical wellness as well. Okay. I guess that kind of goes into this part. So you stated in an interview, quote, our focus must be to foster resilience through physical and mental health, which is essentially what you just said. You discussed in your book the importance of failing physically to have, quote, a baseline, unquote, of what physical exhaustion is. So I guess these are two different things I'm pointing to, but I'm kind of connecting them together.
So I think one is if you're in a profession like ours. So, you know, I mean, because exhaustion, not every person in the regular community needs to suffer exhaustion all the time. But I think what that was referring to is, you know, if you're in uniform, if you're a firefighter and you haven't been exhausted, extremely overheated, you know, whatever it is, that severe discomfort that you would find in the middle of a structure fire or a firefight, you know, in Afghanistan, and you're not training that, you know, the kind of, you know, they say sweat on the training ground so you don't bleed on the battleground, that kind of mentality, that is a massive disservice in this profession. So you have to seek discomfort, but equally, obviously, you have to seek rest and recovery. If you just keep,
Mhm.
thumping and thumping, you're going to break as well.
Sure. So I agree with that. I think it does translate, though, to the normal civilian, the physical exhaustion thing. I think physical exhaustion translates to, and just suffering through physical exhaustion, like purposeful or intentional, not unintentional, but intentional physical exhaustion, suffering through that transfers through domains of just day-to-day life. There's some sort of weird capacity for someone to know, oh, I gotta do all these things I'd prefer to avoid today. I gotta pay the bills. I gotta take care of this thing. I gotta run this errand. I gotta do this thing. And then they're like, yeah, that's nothing. I ran 40 miles this weekend. I don't know. Like, so I'll be sore doing those things, and I'd prefer not to do them, but I know I can do them. I know because I have done things that I would prefer not to do physically, and I do them anyway.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I do. And I think, the baseline of activity definitely needs to be higher. And I think that's shared suffering. This is why I had Joe DeSena on a couple of times. I told him, like, one of the most beautiful things I ever witnessed are Spartan races. And it's not, the gazelle that came first place in the first heat. I couldn't care less about that. It's the other heats where the regular people going through, and there's some athletic phenoms, and there's some, I love to run with Operation Enduring Warrior. So, you've got amputee veterans that are helping other people through and getting their confidence back. There are people that obviously are deconditioned, that are trying to, get themselves back to a healthier lifestyle. You see people helping each other over the obstacles, and then, hugging each other at the end. That shared suffering part of physical activity, I think, is a really important thing. And you see it in boot camps and selection processes and fire academies. And it forges this kind of brotherhood and sisterhood. Well, the extension of that is in the community, whether it's a mud run, whether it's, whatever it is, a triathlon. Doing something that's uncomfortable together in a community will bring you closer, which is exactly what we need. It's so divisive at the moment. The more things we can do that pull us together, the better.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's an area of weakness for me, honestly. Like the time I get together and exercise with other people is at a race. It's not in the training of it, And so that's something I need more of in my life, is like trying to get people together to like train for the big race instead of the actual big race itself. But okay, so I want to get into sleep deprivation. So I know this is a topic near and dear to your heart, and this is a topic that's also near and dear to my heart. And I think if there's a pyramid of like, here's what troubles branch off of, or vice versa, health branches off of, it's sleep. And there's a reason why, like, Maslow kind of said, hey, like, really emphasize sleep. Years and years ago, Maslow was saying, like, sleep, guys. Like, there's these other hierarchies, but sleep, because these other hierarchies will be benefited as a result of sleep. I'd love to hear your insights on it, because people understand it generally, but I don't think they really, really understand it. I don't think they really prioritize it. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, it's such an important conversation. In the fire service, there's kind of two channels to look at it. So first, you have performance. If you do any sort of behind the scenes, documentary or research on elite athletes, your favorite athletes, if we're talking about NFL, NBA, these people that are consistently paid, maybe not so much the UFC, because, you lose 3 fights in a row, you're discarded. So, I wouldn't say that was the same kind of sport to look at, but they have experts from all these things, and sleep is imperative. And I've had so many people from strength and conditioning that have worked with some of the most elite teams and won the championships, and a lot of them say, look, we talk about diet, we talk about exercise, they're like, if you're not sleeping, those two pillars are almost pointless. So if we're talking about performance, I'll sleep when I'm dead and all that macho bullshit is just, you're kind of opting to be a worse version of yourself from a performance standpoint. Now, if we're getting kind of more so into my community now, you're so far from performance that you're actually operating at a detriment. So Green Beret selection, they're deliberately sleep depriving. The buds and the SEALs, they're deliberately sleep depriving to weed people out. Interrogation techniques, you're deliberately sleep depriving. You have a firefighter that's worked 72-hour shifts, so 3 days without sleep, or very, very poor quality sleep if they have. Now you're asking them to drive that fire engine, lights and sirens, amongst traffic where your wife and kids are on their way home or crossing that intersection. I mean, how many times have we seen emergency vehicles kill people at an intersection? Were they just saying, I don't care about red lights? Or did they have a micro sleep, not even realize it was a red light because they blanked out for a few seconds, and now they're upside down wondering what just happened? So, the performance side, I mean, again, law enforcement, the teenager that reaches for his license and the sleep-deprived policeman shoots him, we never hear that conversation, do we? Those gray area shootings, not the ones that they were completely wrong, not the ones where it was a justified shoot, but that gray area, how much does sleep deprivation factor into that young person now being dead? So the performance and the danger of, the lack of performance is one conversation in itself. The other side, though, is the chronic disease, and that's mental health and physical health. And I've always said firefighters don't die of one thing, we die of everything. Whatever the weakest link in the chain, we're going to die from. And so, you look at our cancers, it's all the cancers that we get. I mean, there's some that are a little bit more kind of, male or female dominated, but it's not one thing. It's not, it's always lung cancer because we breathe in, the smoke. It's, I compare the conversation with cancer in the fire service and also mental health in the fire service. The mental health, like, oh, well, James, you were at 9/11 or you were at the Vegas shooting. To me, that's like looking at COVID-19. That was a virus. So that could be your carcinogen from a fire. It can be that acute trauma you had in Afghanistan or whatever it is. But the other side of the conversation is the resilience of the human being. If you're resilient, that cancer won't be able to initiate. You'll absorb that carcinogen and you'll get rid of it, hopefully. You'll be able to process that trauma, and because of coping mechanisms, it'll become, long-term memory. But through sleep deprivation, we're destroying that resilience. We're destroying the ability. We literally, can't process trauma if we're not sleeping. The brain literally takes a bath, for lack of a better description, when we sleep, and it processes those thoughts. You think about musculoskeletal injuries. When you're into exercise, you understand that whether it's learning a skill or, we're breaking down the muscle through weight training, it's when we sleep that we heal, that we rebuild, we process that skill. So if you're not sleeping, you're more likely to get, knees, shoulders, back, the injuries there. The immune system, the people that we sent out with no PPE when COVID first hit were arguably some of the most immune compromised people we have: doctors, nurses, firefighters, EMS. Now, fast forward a year later, all of a sudden everyone calls them murderers because they wouldn't take a vaccine, but that's another entire conversation. And then cancer as well. So you've got all these things. And then you look at the hormonal disruption, and you look at my community, young, fit firefighters are barely 30 years old with testosterone of 250, 200. And now we're wondering about the fertility problems. I just had an expert the other day saying that we have a much higher incidence of issues with our children's health. So there's a reproductive side. And then you've got weight gain, which then leads to the diabetes and the heart disease. So sleep is everything. It's everything, which is why if you didn't have electric lights, you wouldn't have a choice. Soon after the sun set, if you lived in a house with no power, you would fall asleep because that's what we're supposed to do. But because of this artificial world that we've created, we're able to stay up. But in my community, what we haven't balanced with, we'll be awake for 24 hours or ready for 24 hours. You guys go to sleep. We got this. Go rest. We haven't balanced that with, well, in return, we'll give you enough time to rest and recover. So in my community, what I'm seeing is, as I said before, they're dying of everything.
So you can see where sleep is affecting so many different areas. Like you said, even within obesity, I mean, there's no doubt that sleep is also affecting what that current study that just came out within the birth rates drastically dropping. And that's going to heavily impact everything if that continues. It has an impact on so many other areas of life. And I'm not sure people understand it to its fullest extent. but hopefully those that have listened to this can have a better understanding of it. And then the big thing, so speaking about trauma, I'm a trauma therapist, and like you said, sleep helps you process the day's information. And you just had this guest on, and she spoke about it very well, Dr. Sarah Jenke. She talked about how it's likely that trauma is further being embedded as a result of poor sleep. So you're not being able to process that trauma throughout the evening in a way so that you're more resilient when you wake up. And I've worked with firemen and paramedics and combat veterans and the whole smorgasbord of trauma and service members. But yeah, like within all that, there's a common thread of poor sleep. And then also like a machismo within the bad sleep too. Like you said, yeah, I drank a fifth last night and I got 3 hours of sleep, and here I am today. I'm showing up at PT and I'm ready to go. Like, look how awesome and macho I am, while I vomit the whole time on this morning's run. So I can't imagine within the schedule that, because I felt called out appropriately. I think it was in your book where it's like this myth that firefighters have the best schedule. And I've said it for years, up until relatively recently, probably until you called me out through your book. So I had this understanding that firefighters just had the best schedule ever. And so let's talk about that myth, this amazing schedule that firefighters have, and how that breaks down actually from an hour perspective. Because I never thought about the time that it takes you to recover when you do actually get home as well. And that needs to play a role. So yeah, let's talk about that. And then we can go into the 24/72.
Well, firstly, I mean, to be very honest, I believed this myth too. And you got to remember, this is a profession where a lot of people in the US do it for free, and the UK, they're paid on call at least. And, which is an appropriate system if you are truly out in a very rural area. The problem is in America, they've abused the volunteer fire service, and now you have suburban neighborhoods in New Jersey that rely on volunteers. So I had someone on recently, and I don't want to misquote, but I think in his career, the call loads had gone up 200% just from 1987 when he started to current day. So that's an immense increase of calls, because we started fusing with EMS. And then even departments that had EMS, they weren't transporting. Then we started transporting. So now we're the ones taking them to the hospital as well. And then you have the 911 abuse that's just got worse and worse and worse. And our god-awful healthcare here has got more people relying on us just for any sort of healthcare, because they can't afford it. And ironically, it's more of the, not to use class systems, but the middle class. We're not poor enough to have health insurance for free, and we're not rich enough to be able to afford it. Especially, God forbid, if you're an entrepreneur or something. So we got a very broken system, and they lean on us for everything. And so then you add into that old school work schedule, what we actually work, we say we work 1 day on, 2 days off, or a lot of people say, I only work 9 days a month. What it actually is a 24-hour shift. So an average civilian work day is 9 hours with a 1 hour lunch. So it's an 8-hour day. I think that's pretty universally accepted, a 40-hour week. And so you've got 3 of those crammed together, 24 hours, of which you're also not sleeping. So then that second day, which we say a day off, it's not, because you work from midday to 8 a.m. So then you go home having worked, full 8 hours on that second day. And then, so you only have that third day, which is actually a day off. So it's not 1 day on, 2 days off. It's actually 3 days on, 1 day off. And so then when you lay that out, it's not 9 days a month. It's actually 30 days a month, pretty much. So now all of a sudden it doesn't make sense. And when I get people to take a step back and go, look, forget all the shapes and schedules. Just look at how many hours you work a week. 56 versus 42. The ones saving lives, 56. The ones working in the bank, 40. It doesn't compute in any way, shape, or form. But we've believed our lives. We've done a terrible, terrible job of educating the public on what we do. Like I always tell people, if it doesn't involve being arrested, we do everything else. And it's not, to beat our chest. It's just the way it is. Your kid goes down a sewage pipe, it's the fire service is going to go get them. A plane crashes into a tree, it's us. A lot of the ocean lifeguards are even a part of the fire service. And that's another incredible profession. So you're asking these people to do basically everything, but with none of the support. And then what will happen, going back to the mandatory overtime, is you get that overtime whore who has been forced to work lots of shifts and then maybe has taken, signed up for some. They'll be like, well, Steve made $180,000 last year. Wow, firefighters make so much. But he's worked umpteen hours and barely seen his family the whole year. So again, it's not an apples to apples comparison. And even if you looked at our salary, if you compare what we make for 56 hours, you can't. So you have to, divide 40 by 56 and then times by 100. Now you'll actually see what we actually make compared to a civilian. And it's going to be almost half. So yeah, no matter how you look at it, you realize that we've just been telling ourselves a lie. And the really important factor, because to me, that if it was just human suffering, we would have changed it by now. But sadly, a lot of people are only going to be moved by saving money if they're in business, cities and counties. So now what you've got to do is you've got to look at the downstream and what happens if you literally work people into the ground. Then you have more injuries, more mistakes, more early deaths, all these things. So now the money we spend on workman's comp, the people don't want to do this job anymore because new people are looking at it going, that looks like it's a bit shit. So now we have a recruitment crisis. So now you're having to pay time and a half on top of someone's salary to cover all these spots. You've got medical retirements that you're having to pay out. You've got lawsuits when we make mistakes. And then obviously our insurance premiums are through the roof because we all get sick so much. So the irony is it's an easy fix, but it takes a courageous leader. The money is there, but it's down by the drain where it's all washed. You've got to front load that and put it back. And people in the fire service say, oh, you got to see the fire service like a business. And I always tell them, yeah, you do. So stop modeling an Indonesian sweatshop and start modeling Google or Virgin or a progressive corporation. And look what they do. You know what they do? They invest in their people. They have gyms in their places. A lot of them now are doing 4 9-hour days and finding that they're being just, if not more productive and more innovative. So no matter which angle you look at it, and this is obviously a very fire department specific conversation, it's just about being proactive, not reactive. And I had Tulsi Gabbard on the show, and this principle applies to so much. It applies to the obesity epidemic, the mental health crisis. We have a system where companies make billions of dollars as long as we stay sick. The pharmaceutical companies, the implants, all these things. And the answer is obviously to create an environment like we touched on with COVID, where we create healthy people again and have less of a reliance on healthcare. But the people that sell drugs don't want that to happen. The people that make uniforms and MREs and weapons are not a big fan of peacetime, So we have to be able to take a step back and go, what is the best for the people, not the few companies that benefit from this? And it's the same even with a city or a county. You want to be financially, fiscally sound, hire more firefighters, give them more time off, and you actually save hand over fist financially as well.
So hiring more firefighters, giving them more time off, and specifically that schedule that you're looking for, or for you that, and by the way, the math has come a long way since college for you. But yeah, so, but for you, the 24/72 schedule seems to be the right ratio.
Yeah. So what you're doing is you're putting an extra 24 hours in between each of these shifts. So like I said, that first day is a wash. You've got off at 8 a.m, probably not slept. So that first day, anyone who's in this job will tell you they're a zombie. So now you've given the next day, they woke up and, next to their wife or husband or partner, and they got to have breakfast with their kids, and they went to bed knowing they didn't have to go to work the following morning. Then the next day they're ramping up again. So it's just a 24-hour period. And one of the pushbacks I get is, well, we can't hire firefighters now. How are we supposed to get an extra shift? You can't hire firefighters now because the working conditions are awful. And this young generation has got all this information. Like I said, 20 years ago, I knew nothing about the fire service. Now you Google firefighter, you get, 9/11 and heroes and ladder 49, but you also get cancer, suicide, overdose, divorce in the same Google search. So now people are really able to see, what is this actually like? What's this mandatory overtime? What? I can't go home the next morning? That they're weighing this up in their career choices. And they may be phenomenal firefighters, police officers, whatever it is. But now let's say law enforcement, they wanted to be a cop, and then they're like, wow, this person did the right thing, and then their agency, pulled their legs out from under them. I don't know if I want to work for a tribe that's not going to support me. So these are really important parts of the recruitment conversation. If you actually show, and this has happened to some of the departments that have moved to 24/72, when you show potential candidates, we actually give a shit about you, and we're going to focus on giving an environment for you guys to succeed and give you more time with your family, you start having people lining up around the building wanting to work for you again. So that solution, we can't hire people, you've got to ask yourself, why can't we hire people? And if you were you at 20 years old right now, would you want to work where you work? And if not, fix it.
So the firemen that have been in it for 20 years, you're going to get the classic. I'm guessing you would get the classic, I've done it. I've been doing it for years. I'm fine. Everything's good. We don't need to change anything. Kind of rigid within the stance, because I used to walk 20 miles barefoot in the snow type of thing. And so you're going to get a certain mentality that's closed off to it. I guess when you've faced that, when you've faced somebody or a district or whatever, a captain or I don't know, whoever you're talking to or presenting this to, and it's trying to be shut down, like how do you kind of try to navigate making this very common sense approach that you're bringing actually break beyond the rigid thinking patterns of the old guard?
I think we're fortunate where there are already cracks in that, thank God. One of my friends from one of the places I just worked not too long ago was kind of chirping off with that old school mentality. Well, maybe some people aren't supposed to be firefighters. And it was a response to a firefighter suicide. Very, very cold and disconnected. But there's two ways of looking at it. Firstly, it's performance. Again, ask yourself, all right, why doesn't your favorite NHL player stay awake every third day? Because we know it makes you worse. So if you're the chest beating alpha, it never did me any harm, you're fighting against change and you're hanging on to being a shittier firefighter. So there's that point. For me, the massive motivator, literally the origin story of the Behind the Shield podcast, is 6 funerals. That's why I'm not a firefighter, as far as I'm not paid to be a firefighter anymore. And I still am fighting this fight because there's nothing worse than watching a broken-hearted family being handed a folded flag and a fire helmet. So the chest beating, oh, I was okay for me. What a selfish attitude. Firstly, you're probably hurting, which is why you're saying that in the first place. You just don't have the courage to actually come out and be vulnerable. But secondly, let's say hypothetically that you're still in amazing health. You're a medical anomaly. You're Kim Jong-il. You don't have a butthole and your resting heart rate is 20. Okay. Then why are you not advocating for everyone else? Why? Because you're this whole I got mine thing. It's like the pushback against having a universal healthcare in this country. Well, why would I want to help someone else? So I'm pretty sure the place that you go to worship, the dude that you read about wouldn't have been like, I got mine, fuck everyone else. So there's that shift too. Like think about, what you're taught, that compassion. But the biggest thing is we're not okay. Like literally, we just lost an Ohio firefighter to suicide, literally the town next to where my wife grew up. And then where I live, we've had a suicide and overdose in the last, within, I think it was 6 weeks of each other, where I used to work. And then where I live, just over a year ago, we had 2 firefighters, each of which were either side of 30 years old, kill themselves, within 12 weeks of each other. So you're telling me there isn't a problem? So this is the thing. You want to bury your head in the sand or up your own ass and ignore this or come out with that ridiculous, it was fine for me. You're ignoring all science when it comes to performance. You're ignoring everything that your favorite athletes go through. you're pushing against progress. And then that whole, rub some dirt in it, be a real man. Listen to the Behind the Shield podcast, where I've got members of the SAS and SEAL Team 6 and, all these other alpha professions that are in tears because they actually have the courage to be vulnerable. They're not saying, I did it, so, everyone else should. So to me, those are the words of the coward, to be completely blunt. Because if you're not advocating for what you call your brothers and sisters, then you're a coward. It's that simple.
I'm just going to give some space for that because it needs to be soaked in for a little bit before I jump in with some ridiculous statement. Yeah, I kind of going off of some of the research with Dr. Matthew Walker and even what Dr. Sarah Jenke, Jenke,
yes.
And very sorry, Dr. Sarah Jenke, if you're hearing this, and I'm screwing up your name. And I want to have you on the podcast, by the way, if you hear this. But she was saying, and Matthew Walker pointed this out too, where like sleep deprivation, your reaction time is at best the same as to where if you're intoxicated, and likely worse, the reaction time. And so the way you bring it up is you say, do you want somebody from some first responder unit coming to save your child or your wife or whatever who's sleep deprived? And the way I think about it is, do you want somebody intoxicated showing up to your house to save your family member? We live in a rural area. I mean, we had choking incidences, which was like with two of my kids, shocking incidences that kind of we let's just say we've had firefighters called out here several times. I have 4 boys, and yeah, I don't want, whether they're volunteer firefighters or they're hired on full-time firefighters, I don't want any of them to be intoxicated. So I definitely don't want them to be sleep deprived either. It makes no sense. It would be, it's an offense.
Yeah. Well, Matthew Walker, I think you probably heard me talk about Sarah about this. When he did that study, I'm assuming that he got, because this is normally how it happens, college students from the school that you're doing the research volunteer or get paid, $50, whatever, to participate. And so they probably kept him awake for 24 hours and then gave them cognitive tasks before and after. And like, oh, wow, you've the same as being blood alcohol 0.1. But imagine doing that for 10, 20, or 30 years every third day, and then throw in where you do 2 days straight with no sleep. You know what I mean? Now you're far from 0.1. And this is what my argument is. We're nowhere near that anymore. We're so much worse than 0.1. So you're arguably more that sloppy drunk by that point, especially if you're doing like a 48 and you're getting your rear end handed to you. So yeah, I think that's an even more powerful conversation. Is the 0.1 is like best case, surgical example, but where we are is probably far worse than that.
Yeah. And to further that point, like I love how Matthew Walker brings up that like sleep is the best performance enhancing drug a human being can take. Mm-hmm. If you're interested in performance, and as you call them, I love this phrase. I never heard it until I heard you say it, a tactical athlete. So if you're a tactical athlete, you're working on the front lines in some form or fashion, you're a tactical athlete. And if you are, then performance ought to be a goal of yours, or high performance ought to be a goal of yours. But I think even for the common man and woman out there, performance and whatever they're doing ought to be a priority for you, and thus making the thing that helps you perform better, sleep, be a priority, right? So yeah, I just wanted to hammer that home because I think sleep's connection to resilience and areas that can help you become resilient is so huge. And I've never been a very good sleeper, but I know this. Like, let me rephrase. When I was a kid, apparently I could sleep like that. After the military, it took some, like, they put me on medication immediately. It took a long time to realize that's not helpful, and that's actually making things worse. And the sleep medication specifically was horrendous, and I think it made me trying to get back on track that much worse for a long period of time. And so anyway, like, my sleep now, after using certain habits and things to try to help mitigate or induce a sleepy state has really been prioritized over the last 5 years, I would say, maybe more.
Just to jump in there, when you're talking about
Yeah.
sleep meds, this is a big misnomer too, is that I had Kurt Parsley on multiple times. He's the one that really turned me on to understanding sleep deprivation. And he was on Barbell Shrugs. So his initial conversation with them was about performance. It was an old weightlifting show. But he was talking about a study where, I think it was Benadryl, if I'm not mistaken, one of the kind of over-the-counter sleep meds. But when they compared, people who didn't sleep, like shift workers, and people who use sleep aids like that, the sleep aid users had the diminished lifespans as well. And so the problem is that people are told, oh, we'll give you something to sleep. No, you're given something to be unconscious, but none of these put you to a deep restorative sleep. So it's a big misnomer. So if you're on Unisom or, one of the prescription strength ones, and wondering why you feel worse, it's because you're not getting in that deep restorative sleep. The same with alcohol. It keeps us out of that. Mm-hmm. So the only way, and it's hard when you're kind of drowning emotionally, but the only way to actually get that deep restorative sleep, and then Doc Parsley actually has a sleep formula. It's a supplement, and it's not a shitload of melatonin. It's like a little cocktail. But it's really, really good to kind of wean you off what you're on at the moment. But yeah, just like you said, the sleep hygiene and winding down and not being around screens and blue blocking glasses and getting the temperature down to where it needs to be. If you can get yourself to sleep naturally, that is the sleep that they're talking about. Taking a Benadryl or NyQuil or whatever it is that you're using as an aid, or God forbid, alcohol, you're not getting that deep restorative sleep that you need.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, talking about PTSD, firefighters with it, and one of the problems being sleep as a result of it. Okay, so we can pinpoint an area that maybe, or likely, I shouldn't say maybe, likely helps embed trauma to be longer lasting and for you to be less resilient because of the poor processing through sleep. What are some of the modalities now that a person has trauma that you've either been through yourself or have seen or have had professionals come on that help servicemen and women, frontline responders, all that sort of thing, process after the fact?
Well, I think the first thing, just to clarify, is I think a lot of us, and I never really had deep struggles, but I think a lot of us suffer from moral injury. And I love that term, because you're not having the classic clinical signs of PTSD. You're not having nightmares or flashbacks or, dropping under a table, when a car backfires. But, that organizational betrayal, that feeling of guilt or shame because you couldn't save that person or, whatever it is, I think that is, that death by 1,000 cuts is actually what a lot of, responders are really experiencing, not PTSD specifically. And again, that's up to the clinicians, obviously, to diagnose which of those. But the conversation that I think needs to happen now, and I've said this a lot recently, is we talk about stigma. We've got to smash the stigma. And I think we have, mostly. There's still those people, but I think there really are less and less of them. But if you just smash the stigma, then, like you said, now what? Right, hey, I've got it. I got moral injury, I got PTSD, I got PTS, whatever, whatever acronym you want to use. That's where we've done a really poor job. Now, the actual kind of logistics, the barrier to entry, we have a thing called EAP, which I've heard so many horror stories. Just a city will just get a random group of clinicians, most of whom probably have never worked with first responders before, which results in the responder feeling even worse. And sadly, I think a lot of people that had that experience aren't with us anymore, because they tried, they went to a clinician, the clinician burst into tears and told them to get out because they couldn't help them, and then they end up stuck in a gun in their mouth. So, that's a big part. But I think the post-traumatic growth conversation really needs to happen, like we said about earlier, about the resilience. And so firstly, being driven to find those tools because you truly believe that there's a better version of yourself on the other side gives hope. It makes it exciting. Even though you might be struggling, there's a reward to this. Not the kind of message that we had a lot recently. Well, I kind of live with my PTSD and, I've got my dog now. what a shitty message. That I don't believe that's the case. The human body and the human experience is such an incredible thing that if some of these men and women that have gone through absolute horrific stuff, like Dr. Edith Eger I had on the show, who's an Auschwitz survivor, and she became a psychologist, if she can process it, that means there's hope for everyone. But it doesn't mean that how we get there looks the same way, and it might take a long time. But this, you'll be okay, I don't think that's the right message. I think we have to really talk about resilience, about post-traumatic growth. But what's also presented so poorly is the average firefighter says, hey, I need help, and they go down that EAP route. They're going to basically be offered counseling, talk therapy, maybe some EMDR. That seems to be spoken about more. But again, death by 1,000 cuts, EMDR, from what I'm hearing over and over again, is great for that acute event that really bothers you, but is not really good at unpacking years of trauma. And then, the psychiatric meds, which a lot of, I know a lot of veterans talk about that in the VA all the time. And it's the same in my community. But what's not being discussed are, all these incredible retreats that people can go, the rucking community, surfing, diving, equine therapy, canine therapy, and then psychedelics, ketamine, MDMA, ayahuasca, all these other, ibogaine. And so now you're looking at this toolbox and like, bloody hell, it's huge. And it's like you and I saying, we're going to get fit. When you're an elite runner, and, I'm a martial artist who likes the kind of high intensity CrossFit style, the way that we're going to get fit, the way that we're going to eat, the way that we're going to overcome that quitter in our minds, each of our journeys is going to look completely different. Your wellness toolbox is very different than my wellness toolbox. And so it's no different with mental health. So I think it's very exciting that there are so many things, and we have to give hope to people. Just because you tried talk therapy and you did EMDR twice doesn't mean that that's a magic bullet for you. It's probably not. So it's finding these other things. It might take, ketamine to open a door and then back to counseling. And now you're like, well, I discovered some things I never realized were there. I was actually molested by my grandfather, or it could be something far less acute than that. But now then you're unpacking it with the counselor because you've used psychedelics to open a door, for example. So I think this is what I'm seeing is we thought the options were so narrow, and then the result was always to be able to live with your PTSD. And of course, don't get me wrong, that there are some levels of depression, anxiety, and some of these other areas that these poor people are just, they really, really do find it almost impossible to get out of that. But even them, can we do better? Can we get them a little bit better? But for most people, I think that there's a really beautiful version of themselves on the other end. And now you've got this massive toolbox. They can start selecting things and trying things and go, what, ketamine didn't work. I'm going to go try this. And it actually was a hiking group that they joined, that ended up being the thing. So that's what I'm seeing is the kind of knee-jerk offering is this narrow set of therapeutic elements and this very gray doom and gloom result. And what we need to do is pull the curtain all the way back, and especially with this ridiculous prohibition laws that we have, give our veterans and first responders access to all the things that are clearly working, because a number of success stories I've had from psychedelics, for example, on here from veterans and first responders is mind-blowing. But then infuse that element of hope, inspire someone to want to get better. So I think that's the issue. And then the other thing that I'll just kind of plug this in quickly, that I also never hear discussed is, and I've talked about this over and over again because I think it needs the airtime. When we hear people, old school people, talking about suicide, it's so selfish, it's so cowardly. How could you do that? Think about your kids. What I'm realizing now is through the things that we've discussed, sleep deprivation and trauma and unaddressed trauma in early life and alcohol use and these other things, the brain gets so miswired that reality truly becomes distorted. And a person in their heart of heart believes that they are the reason for their family's pain. And if I just take myself out, they will be happier. My kids will be happier. That needs to be put in the conversation too, because these tools can get them back to be able to think normally. But if I think this is what a poster should say, if you start feeling like you're a burden to the people you love, that's a massive red flag. And if you hear your friends talking like that, that's a big red flag for you to interject and start having conversations with your friend. Because this think about your family, call me if you're struggling, that's not working. And if you think about saying, think about your family to someone who's signed it on a dotted line saying they will die for complete strangers and now truly believes that they are the problem, and you say, think about your family, they're thinking I am. And so then in that distorted state, that makes suicide courageous and selfless. But you can't understand it with a healthy mind. But in that distorted mind, it makes perfect sense. So we have to have this conversation of understanding that the brain can become broken. And I say broken with immense empathy. It's been miswired, and we have to help them get back to rewire. And that element seems to be extremely powerful from the psychedelic side.
What you're trying to do to reframe so that people can understand the suicidal side of things or suicide ideation and how their mind becomes reframed, or the circuitry creates a narrative that the rest of the world isn't buying into, but for them is as real as it can possibly be, is something that people are really missing. Because it's easy. It's a cop out, and it's lazy to say that it's just selfish. I mean, of course it's selfish, but like there's more, like you said earlier, there's more layers to it. It's not selfish for selfish sake. Like it's not selfish because they're saying F you. Like it could be they're saying, I'm doing this for you.
Exactly. And then it's not selfish, but but it's just a thing. It is not selfish at that moment. Does it have an immense negative effect on everyone outside? Of course, that's a reality. Yeah. So how can we get them back? Because I always tell people, imagine this: you and I go to the top of a really tall building, and pre-fire, pre-military, you and I stand side by side on the edge of the building. There's going to be that invisible hand pushing you back, going, "What the hell are you doing?" Now, fast forward to your darkest times. That hand goes from in front to behind. And it's like, if you jumped, your family would be happier. We have an innate built-in mechanism to survive, to carry on our lineage, to protect our children from the harms, watch them grow up. And then once they're on their own feet, and we get to an elderly age, then we pass away and we know that we've done our thing. It is completely against the human experience to take your own life.
Wonderful insight, James. So thank you for that. My only 2 cents I would throw in there from a modality standpoint. So I'm a brain spotting practitioner for trauma, and it was derived from EMDR, right? So it's pulled out of EMDR, but it's flexible, and it's in how all somatic therapies, the somatic therapies that work is similar to that of psychedelic drugs. And the way I would dummy it down is like, it takes you from being an actor in the scene to a director in the scene, right? And now you can start to direct the scene in front of you and see the result in a different light, right? And then even kind of change some of the results of what have happened to you. Some people can recreate a new narrative too, which is interesting. So brain spotting is similar to EMDR in the fact that it's a somatic therapy. However, it isn't only for the one acute thing. Like you said, it covers a broad span. It can be acute as well as wide ranging, just depending on the skill set of your brain spotting practitioner. Yeah. So that's something I'd say, but then to kind of jump in rhythm with what you were saying before, is that's something to catapult you into life. And then take on other experiences of life that's also going to be helpful and continue to make you get better and better and thrive and improve. It's not just go to your nearest EMDR brain spotting practitioner, ketamine psychologist or whatever, and then do the few sessions, and then boom, you're cured. Get an attaboy, a pat on the bottom, and say, good luck to you. Life's great now. No, like, because now there's other areas for you to continue to grow in, so that you can now cement the work that you've done. Don't let that go to waste. It's like, going to the gym, getting in really good work, and then going and eating like garbage afterwards. Like you're wasting what you did. You're wasting the hard work that you just put in. So use it as something to catapult you into other areas so that you start thriving in the other areas. And the more you thrive, the more you prove yourself wrong, the more you learn how to fail appropriately through attempting challenging things, the better life becomes. The wider range of what you feel like you're capable of doing becomes. So yeah. Really appreciate this conversation, James. Anything you feel like you wanted to include or add into the conversation?
No, I think we've covered a lot. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is what I like about it. I never, prepare for an interview when I'm on the show, because I mean, it organically comes out, and yeah, I think we've covered a lot. And I think some important things have been said. We may not have kind of, gone down timelines specifically, but I think that there's I mean, especially with your background in military and now psychology, it's a great opportunity to address some areas that you just don't hear talked about very much.
Yeah. Well, man, I was honored to have you on, James. What a cool gift this was for the Patina'd Podcast. So thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Patina'd Podcast. There are other shows that emphasize resilience, but my intent is to normalize personal development through embracing challenge by interviewing the common man and woman, the person that you and I can relate to. If you are someone who wants to soak up the insights of normal people doing extraordinary things, please subscribe. If you know somebody who is overwhelmed by fear and complacency, please share this podcast with them. I'm your host, Kenny Hill, and I run a private practice near Sacramento, California called Recovery Hill. My website is in the description tab along with my social media links. The intro music was A Two in the Back, performed by Sunday at Slim's on Blue Dot Sessions.